Dave, this is the show where Bret Hart, in the closing scene, is hoisted up on the shoulder of all the baby faces and gets this big, heartwarming applause. And I've heard it framed, and it's kind of a compilation of different bits and pieces I've heard over the years, so I don't really know who would author this particular version of history, but that somehow this closing scene of Bret standing tall with the belt was an I'm sorry from Vince McMahon in some way, or from the WWF for doubting Bret as champion, or considering going all the way with Lex Luger in the months prior to this. Was there some kind of larger message in the closing scene of WrestleMania 10 with Bret once again clutching the belt?
I've never heard that. I mean, it could be true, but I don't know. I've never heard that. That doesn't ring a bell to me, because the thing is even then, I don't think Vince was committed to Bret. Bret was more the stopgap guy, and by then, I'm trying to see now. This was, this is '94. So this was before Kevin Nash, because Kevin Nash was the guy.
Kevin Nash wins in November '94 over Backlund.
Right. Kevin Nash, I don't know when the decision was made with Kevin Nash, because that came out of nowhere to me. But when it happened, it was made very clear to me that Kevin Nash was going to be the next Hulk Hogan, and he was going to be champion for years and years, which obviously didn't happen because he didn't draw as champion.
I started to feel it at King of the Ring '94 when Bret had that 4.5-star match with Kevin Nash, and you knew they were setting him up for to be a title challenger.
Right. Well, I knew he was going to be a challenger, but I didn't know he was going to win the title.
Yeah.
And then it went through Backlund, who I also was. I know that Backlund was promised the title on his comeback, but I just thought that by that point, because Backlund was considered for the championship in '92.
Mm-hmm.
It came down to it was Bret Backlund, and I forgot who the other ones were. I
know Bryan Adams was on the list because I read that Observer recently.
Wow, I didn't even remember that anymore. God, Bryan Adams, he was a big impressive guy, but.
Kona Crush, he was rocking the orange and purple outfit and everything, and he had the size. And
he had the size, but he would have been a terrible champion.
Well, Backlund would have been too.
Backlund would have been terrible too, yeah. And Tito Santana always claimed that he was on the list, and I have no reason to. It didn't sound right given where Tito was at that point in his career, but I also have no reason to doubt it.
Yep.
And I know Kurt, but Kurt Hennig may have been injured at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But I know Kurt was very. There were a lot of guys, when Bret was champion that time, guys were, a lot of guys were bitter because with Hogan, it was, Hogan was larger than life and drawing big money and everything. And,
you couldn't dispute that. You couldn't,
Right. Even people who didn't like Hogan, you would have to be, really business stupid to think that, Hogan shouldn't be champion. With Bret, Bret's a great wrestler, and you could, I even think as a wrestler to have good matches at that time, to have believable world championship matches, that Bret was, in my mind, the best guy in the company then. Having said that, I don't know that business-wise he was the best guy, but there was no best guy. Once Hogan's out of the picture, and Warrior's, by this time, Warrior's long out of the picture, and Warrior wasn't going to be the best guy at this point anymore anyway. So, your choices. Shawn wasn't quite ready yet. He was going to get a shot. And Vince was definitely behind Shawn when that happened. Nash, Nash was pretty green. Certainly not ready.
I don't know if he was even in the company yet. He wasn't.
Yeah. And Scott Hall wasn't quite at that level, I don't think. Was Scott even in the company?
Well, Scott was on the '92 series with Flair versus Kurt and Savage.
Right, when Kurt was in there.
So he come in about 2 months beforehand, I think.
Right. But Kurt was one of those guys who was, if you're Kurt, think about this, okay? Kurt was I'm sure in his own mind, and some people, to me, Kurt was never the same after '91 in the back injury.
Mm-hmm.
But mentally, he's the same Kurt Hennig, and he was still very good.
Sure.
And, if you're Kurt, you're going to resent the fact that Bret is in this position, and you in your mind, made Bret. And for most of that period when Bret and Kurt wrestled, Kurt was the bigger star of the two, until Kurt put him over for the last match. But that's because Kurt was leaving because of the back injury. It wasn't like in Kurt's mind, he put Brett over because I'm leaving anyway, and I'm going to put him over on the way out. It's not like, Brett's a better wrestler than me. So, that's a guy, who's sitting there going like, how come he's got this and I don't? Yep. And I mean, and he wasn't the only one, but, I think a lot of guys were like that in that period of like, why Brett? He's not that big, because they were all conditioned to the big muscular guy.
Well, let's rewind to the fact that the setup for this WrestleMania 10 was the disputed tie finish of the Rumble between Luger and Brett. And one of the great mysteries, I think, to fans of the time period was what exactly was their endgame with Luger and the 93 SummerSlam countout win over Yokozuna, which seemed to say, they went all in with the Lex Express and the whole thing, that he was going to win the championship. What changed? Why all of a sudden was it Brett?
He was never going to win the championship then. He was going to win it at WrestleMania.
Right.
The feeling is this time, they went, all the times I said, like, they changed the title in the first meeting, and the chase could have been better, right?
Mm-hmm.
This one, because of all the momentum with the Lex Express, it's funny. It's like I always had the opposite view, and in the other years it's all disputed because there's whatever, right? Mm-hmm. This one I don't think there's any dispute in the sense of when that match was coming up, the Luger Yokozuna match in Detroit. There was not a doubt in my mind Luger's winning the championship. And there's not a doubt in anyone's mind that Luger's winning the championship. And I believe I believe that it was actually the day after. I was stunned, and I asked, what was it? Don't worry, it's for WrestleMania. The feeling is that we could do a bigger gate at WrestleMania, building it up. And I thought, timing's everything in this business, and he won by count up, but and everything. He kind of failed in a situation that you built up too big. And plus, it's still Lex Luger in the sense of, he was too much like Hulk Hogan. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't as charismatic as Hulk Hogan. So it was almost like I always thought that, like, Lex wasn't the guy. But, for Vince, Lex was, had better head of hair than Hogan, almost as tall, better body than Hogan, more athletic than Hogan. So, I mean, you're looking at not the promo Hogan was, obviously, but, you're looking at it from a Vince perspective, and it's like, yeah, and when the day Luger walked into the business, it was going to be he was the next Hulk Hogan. I mean, from the After Mags and the whole bit, he was the guy. Mm-hmm. And so now Vince had him, and, he had the great physique, and it's like he's going to be the guy. And what happened, they were going with him, and then at the Rumble, they let those two out there, and they were going to do the draw, and the crowd was completely for Brett, and it wasn't for Luger, and the crowd in Providence won the title for Brett. I mean that is the true story, because I remember after that, it was only days after that where somebody very high up there just goes, we're real big on market research. Well, that was our market research. That the people wanted, and they did. There was that feeling of like, it was the first one where you had the thing like you had with Daniel Bryan and Dave Bautista this year, but it was on a much bigger basis. But that was the first one where I think you had this audience, because again, wrestling was not hot then; it was cold. So you're down to your hardcore audience, and your hardcore audience, number one, they knew Brett was the better wrestler, and number two, they knew Luger was being chosen by the people in charge. And Luger, the body thing was going out. It wasn't as, it was like that era was over and it was becoming a wrestling era. And Luger was from that other era. And also Luger, I think, to some people's eyes, still represented WCW. And the WWF fans hated WCW. And Brett was homegrown. And they'd seen him grow from the bottom to the top. And they kind of resented that him losing the championship when he did and the way that all went down. So he had a little bit of momentum behind him anyway with that audience. And but anyway, whatever it was that night in Providence. The crowd went with Brett, and that was it. That I don't know that the decision was made on that night to go with Brett. I think the decision was actually not made until February. So it was a couple. This is January, so it's a couple weeks later. Mm-hmm. But it was because of what happened that night and arguments that all stem from, well, in Providence, this is our market research. They were for Brett, and that was the swing vote.
So they went into Royal Rumble 1994 with the idea for this disputed finish as a litmus test, expressly to see who got over.
No. it was not meant as a litmus test. It was just meant to have a disputed finish, so you'd have a 3-way program for WrestleMania, and you'd get Bret involved in the program to create some intrigue. But it was meant for Lex Luger was always supposed to win, and it became the litmus test when they cheered for Bret. It was not like, well, whoever they cheer for is going to get the title. Because if that was the case, the next day it would have been, okay, well, they cheered for Bret, it's going to be Bret. It was a month later, and it took some convincing of Vince. Vince was still with Luger for a couple of weeks, and then Vince was like, no, you know what, we need to change plans. Bret's got momentum, and Luger doesn't.
It's interesting, because curiously at WrestleMania 10, they did Yokozuna versus Lex Luger first, and Yokozuna wins by disqualification, and then they do a second go at Yokozuna. He works twice at WrestleMania 10 with Bret. So do you think the rough architecture, Dave, was that somehow it would have been a triple threat match with Yokozuna, Lex Luger, and Bret? Those were very uncommon, if not unheard of at the time. Or
I think that they probably would have put Yokozuna and Bret on first, and then have put Yokozuna and Lex on last, and then put Bret and Owen on later in the show, which would have been tough, because then you would have had, or maybe I don't know how they would have done it. I mean, what they did ended up being perfect, because you created, Bret won the championship and Owen beat Bret. So Owen became the perfect number one contender, and became a superstar in one night. So, I mean, the way it played out was, tremendous, I thought. The story of that night was I don't think people remember that as like this all-time great show. And I actually thought it was like the two matches, Bret and Owen and Shawn and Razor in the ladder match were, in my mind, on that day, the two best matches in WWE history, or WWF history. Up until that point. I mean, now the Shawn Razor ladder match, because it ended up being topped, people don't remember it as fondly, but goddamn, on that day, that match was unbelievable, and Bret and Owen was just fantastic. So, but yeah, I mean, I don't know how they would have done it, but believe me, when that was late, I mean, there's stories about how Lex blabbed and said this and this, and by February, Bret was going to win it. And I know, because they did a taping thing where they taped Luger holding the championship, which never aired on television, with a belt, and that was meant to throw people off into thinking Lex is winning for sure, because someone said, don't, basically, because I was thinking, okay, well, Lex is winning, and someone says, that's to throw people off.
Wow.
So that's when I found out, that Bret was winning.
You mentioned the ladder match. What's the legacy of the Shawn Michaels Razor Ramon ladder match?
Well, it put the ladder match on the map, and it's been, done a million times since then. There was one ladder match in WWF history before that, which was,
Bret and Shawn in '93.
Bret and Shawn for Coliseum Video, right? I don't even think it was it was not on a pay-per-view for sure.
No.
I believe, God, I'm trying to remember. Did Bret and Shawn do a bunch of house show ladder matches before Mania?
Before Mania in 1996?
No, the first one in '94. Because I definitely saw a Bret Hart Shawn match that was really great, and I don't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. It was in there. If it was a ladder match, I think it was a ladder match.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just a regular match.
They had a ladder match. It came out on a Coliseum Video release called Smack'em Whack'em, and it was late '93, and I want to say it was in Canada. And yeah, that was the only one I'd heard of up until that point in time.
Okay, so maybe they just did singles. But I remember seeing Shawn and Razor in a match at a house show that was really great, like just way above what the usual house show matches were, and that's when I got really excited over, God, if they have a match like this at a house show, imagine what they're going to do at WrestleMania. And of course they, topped that to a great degree. The ladder match, it created the second ladder match, which was almost as good, and then then the Dudleys and the Hardys and Edge and Christian, did those absolutely incredible ladder matches. And then ladder matches just became a staple where, unfortunately, like with TNA, I've probably seen 100 ladder matches in TNA, and I don't remember any of them.
Sure. On the Savage...
And WCW, I remember WCW doing ladder matches that were just like, oh, God.
3 count, the Young Dragons.
So that actually was really good.
Yeah.
That one was a hell of a match. But I remember like Eddie Guerrero and Sean Waltman, where you would think it was really good, and it really wasn't even anything special.
On Sold Out, yeah, what a horrible show. Savage and Crush, they do a Falls Count Anywhere match, and one of the quirks about this one was, for some reason, they had the stipulation where you had to return to the ring in 60 seconds. And it really limits like what Savage and Crush could do in the building and exploring Madison Square Garden and fighting each other and broke up the momentum of the match after every fall.
Well, they learned from that, didn't they? Because they stopped. They never did it.
What do you think the idea was? Well,
they were just trying to. They were, the Falls Count Anywhere was not like this historical match. It was like a new match, and they were just trying to. They came up with an idea for it, and they found out. I think in that match actually I thought was pretty good too. But I mean, they I think that they figured out what didn't work, and then they didn't do it again.
And finally, in WrestleMania 10, Dave, what's the state of the WWF from a business perspective, from a prospectus, as far as where they were going? Because 95 wouldn't be a pretty year.
No. I mean, I thought WrestleMania 10 was a great WrestleMania. I thought it was the best WrestleMania up until that point in time, easily. But as far as the popularity of the product, they were struggling. It was the dark days. I mean, they had the scandal. There was no Hogan. The thing with that company, it really wasn't until I would say 97 that they ever really got over losing Hogan. And I mean, there was other reasons too. I mean, even if Hogan had stayed, because Hogan came back in 93 and they did not do well in 93. That's one of the reasons. Look, if they were, you could say Hogan left because of the being asked to lose to Brett. But another reason Hogan left was because Hogan went to some house shows and they drew crappy. And I think Hogan saw the lay of the land of Hogan's a smart cookie when it comes to, or at least he was then, when it comes to not being in something negative. So when he saw, that business wasn't good, he went to I'll go to New Japan where they sell out, and they were going to sell out with or without Hogan, but he went to the hot place. And at that time, WWF was not the hot place, and WCW was not the hot place. And WCW in '94, when they got him, they made him an offer he couldn't refuse. I mean, that was the greatest contract offer in the history of pro wrestling, even though, Austin made more money than Hogan did under this WCW deal. The bottom line is this guy got 25% of every pay-per-view. Wow. I mean, think about that. That was his deal. It was every pay-per-view he got a $600,000 guarantee or 25%. I mean, nobody before, since, ever got. Vince never gave him anything close to that. Nobody gave, Steve Austin, he never got 25% of pay-per-view. I mean, God bless him. Could you imagine if he got 25% of that WrestleMania 17? I mean, right. I mean, my God, he wouldn't even be doing podcasting now, probably. You know what I mean? He probably would have quit earlier.
Yeah.